Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
I accept mine. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
I'm pleased to have His Grace Ramvijay Prabhu.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Could you please just give us a brief overview, if not a short bio of who you are, where you're from?
Okay. I live in Pine Town, which is part of Durban, about 20 kilometers from Sri Sri Radharanath Temple. I'm 49 years old, married with 2 grown-up daughters who are both married also. I work in the IT field. I have a BSc in computer science and a master's in public administration. And I serve in ISKCON in different capacities over the last 30 years or so.
Could you just share with us how you came into contact with Krishna consciousness?
Well, when I was about standard 8, I was reading Prabhupada's books. Some devotees distributed some books of Prabhupada and teaching of Lord Chaitanya. I read it, I liked it a lot, but then I didn't take to it at that time. I had some concerns about ISKCON and things I heard and read. So about 5 years later, I met who is now my wife. She was a Hare Krishna devotee. And then I put my concerns to her. She referred me to other devotees. They resolved all my issues and concerns and reservations. And then I took to the process from that time. From the time I was like 19 years old or so at that time.
This is still in Pine Town?
I wasn't living in Pine Town at that time. I was living in Verulam, which is about small town about 30 kilometers from the central Durban. I was at University of Durban, Westville at that time, part of UKZN. It was one of the campuses. So yeah, that's where I met my wife, who is now my wife, and then got introduced to Krishna consciousness again, and this time I stuck to it.
What was the aha note?
The fact that basically in my background I was very analytical and technical. I have a very seriously left-brained person, so I had all kinds of technical questions, and I was looking for some answers in spiritual paths for many years. I was reading books from the time I was like 12 years old, looking for some spiritual path to answer, because I was unsatisfied with the purpose of life answers given in science. So I was looking for alternatives, and I studied various books that I came across. I just read them, got familiar with them. That's how I came across Prabhupada's book when I was 14 years old. And the main thing that Krishna consciousness did for me was that I stopped asking more questions. So the desire to, need to get more answers and not just get one answer and move to the next question, that thing just subsided after, I got some association with some senior devotees. So that was for me the unique thing about what Krishna consciousness did. With everything else, I learned something, and then I had other issues, and it just changed, evolved from one to the other. With Krishna consciousness, it was just that quelled that desire, totally satisfied the desire. Yeah.
And then growing from there on, how did you navigate through the world having come across Krishna consciousness?
Yeah, I think Krishna helped a lot, because chanting Hare Krishna I took to quite easily. Within a few months I was chanting 16 rounds. I was quite happy. However, living in Durban, coming from an Indian background with a large extended family, I was a little conflicted because I had to give up a lot, because I have a wonderful family. And the extended family was very wonderful also, but a lot of commitment and energy had to go into my extended family. And I didn't know how to get out of that. Literally, that was my difficulty. I could only commit X amount to Krishna consciousness, and I couldn't commit more because I felt I had so much of duty and responsibility to the extended family to attend their social functions, etc. But then Krishna had his own plan. When I finished my degree at that year, I was forced to come to Johannesburg to get a job. So I left that environment. And when I came to Johannesburg, I lived next door to the temple. And
temple is this?
This was the temple in Hillbrow.
Oh, okay.
Yes, there was a temple in Hillbrow at that time in 1989.
Yeah.
1990, that was. And then it was so much easier because I had nothing. There was nothing in Johannesburg. I could work and I could be at the temple.
Yeah.
So Krishna helped me with that situation. And I stayed 5 years in Joburg, and then Krishna consciousness was my life. I never looked back since then. The conflict was resolved. So it was challenging for that first year, in Durban.
Yeah.
I came here 5 years. When I went back to Durban, there was no issue, it was changed. So
outside of the challenges you faced with dealing with your extended family and such, what about navigating through the then apartheid South Africa? How was that?
Oh, yes, it was a little bit challenging, not too bad. I mean, I didn't get heavily exposed to too much, but one of my jobs when I started in Johannesburg was the Transnet. Now that's a government company, and the culture there is quite conservative, in apartheid terms. And what happened is, from the time I got initiated, I took initiation in 1993. I had to shave my head for my initiation, and I thought, not grow back, I'll just keep it like that. And the other thing I did was I started wearing tilak every day to work. So the people at work did give me quite a rough time. They used to call this my ponytail or my horse tail, and they would call this like a bird shat on your face. They would say stuff like that, the kinds of comments I used to get. So it was a little challenging. But the good thing is, I just persevered. I stuck to my principles, stuck to my guns, and then they faded away. I mean, there was an initial reaction, there's an initial reaction to the change, and then it faded away. They were mainly conservative Afrikaner type people, and there weren't very many non-whites in that organization I was working with. So also having been brought up in an apartheid environment, the community, I was in a rural type of area. It was mainly Indian and African people in our area. I hardly met a white person in my life, actually. Yeah. And at the university, it was mainly an Indian university, University of Durban Westville at that time. So when I came here, it was a little intimidating because, we have these preconceptions, that you brought up with and you don't know. Yeah. So it was a little intimidating getting to work. But as you get to know people, you realize it's not such a big deal. As you get to understand and work with people, even though they have their prejudices, etc., they're just people. Yeah. They're just people with prejudices. They're nothing, not monsters, or they're just people with a certain mindset. Yeah. And as I got to see that, I got more comfortable in that environment, even though there were these kinds of exchanges now and then. And then they also got to respect me as a person once they got to know me. I was the only Indian person in the organization at that time, non-white person at that time at all. So they got to respect me, and then it was just people with people. I didn't feel too out of place or anything. I mean, obviously when their social things, their rugby and all the things that I was not into, I couldn't engage with them like in a social level, but I didn't need to. Yeah. I just worked in my own circle, but at work it was reasonable to do my work.
Were there any people that asked any deeper questions?
Oh yes, very. There were many people from that company also. Yeah. What's this? I should take prasad for them sometimes. They were amazed with the food. And there were some people who had deep conversations with, like, many people, they just don't know what the purpose of life is when they go to trauma, especially. Everyone's suffering in the world, So no matter what background they come from, once they get to know you, and they can feel a little comfortable to open up to you, everyone's going through the same thing in a different circumstance, but they're going through the same thing. Yeah. So many people, especially, the older people were not so comfortable with opening up to me. I was a youngster, so it's not in their culture. It's culturally abnormal for a 50-year-old Afrikaner to open up to a 22-year-old person. But the younger people in the organization, 25, 30, that way we could be as peers, they would open up quite often to ask the purpose of life, and I would talk openly about the principles. I was just telling them, these are my understandings of life. It wasn't like I was talking about God. I was just talking about, this is what I understand this world to be about, this is what I understand the purpose of life to be about. And we're so receptive. And then I guess once they feel that you know little, they'll come to you more and more. It develops like that naturally, organically, it just becomes that. Yeah. So there was many good experiences like that with many of the people who worked with, some of the other people service providers and customers, As you got to know them, it also went that way. It was really nice.
Then post 94, looking at the trauma that is the heritage of this country, do you feel that there is some sort of higher need beyond just the Rainbow Nation ideal?
Yes, definitely. We will see that with every ideal we have in this world, it becomes stale after a while, because whatever you aspire to, if it is not spiritually connected in some way, it becomes stale. Whether it's getting the vote, in our case, people vote now. It doesn't mean anything because they feel their lives haven't changed. Similarly, with every other ideal, if they feel getting a house is the ultimate aim of my life, getting shelter, a proper home, people have that and they still want more. Many people have that. Similarly, even if people get economic freedom, like we're talking about now, getting economic, wonderful. Not that we don't want people to get economically well off, to be well situated, but that is not the purpose of their life. It won't satisfy them because we see many people have sufficient money to do whatever they need to do, but there's no real satisfaction in that. So that will always be the case with every country and every people and every nation, every individual. Their personal goals, their goals as a community, their goals as a nation, if they don't connect it spiritually, that goal becomes stale after you achieve it. So our system is we have one goal and then we move to the next goal. And when you reach that, you go to the next goal. So there's no real satisfaction and deep satisfaction. So we have to evolve as a nation to think a little more deeply about who we are as a people, what makes us tick, what is satisfying to us. And until we get there, we'll be moving from one goalpost to the next, fighting about this and then fighting about that. It's the same principle, always.
And with the recent xenophobic attacks,
yes,
I find that a bit contradictory, xenophobic attacks. But the recent attacks in South Africa, what would you say, from your point of view, what would you say is the central cause of that? I'm not an expert on the field or anything like that, but I think there's a lot of, there's just a few people influencing others. That's why you're getting this. And I think the greatest misunderstanding is that we are the body. That's the first problem we get. That people identifying at the bodily platform to say that because they exist from a different country, they are different from us. Ultimately, we're all spiritual beings. And so long as we see people differently like that, we're going to have a major problem. So now it's about people being from a different country. In 6 months' time, it could be people of a different tribe. In 2 years' time, it could be people of a different race, or it could be people of a different gender. It's one or the other. So long as we see the differences on the bodily platform, we will have these kinds of issues. Because now I'm feeling, my bread, the food the job I'm supposed to get is taken by someone else from another country. Of course, there may be political and, control of movement, things that the government may have to do. But to resort to this level of reaction, to go to the extent wanting to kill, people just for that purpose, you're not going to achieve anything meaningful. And it's also a lack of an understanding of how our behavior affects our lives. There is nothing in this world where whatever we do doesn't have an effect. Similarly, if I do something to harm another person, I can expect that something negative is going to befall me at some point. That law of action and reaction is there. So by people reacting so negatively to people, they can expect that some calamity will befall them, and we don't want that. Therefore, it's important we educate people that, yes, we may have challenges, but how do we respond in those challenges in the best way to deal with the cause of the problem, not creating further problems in the way we react. And that's the importance. Intelligent people or people who are of substance would try to consider that. Let's see, we know there's a problem. There's some challenges. Yes, there's scarcity of jobs. There's different challenges people experience. So how do we now address that problem? Just going around looting, burning, killing is not going to solve that problem. It's just mostly going to bring more suffering to us anyway. So that's the... It kind of reminds me of a seminar that was given by Bhaktivedanta Maharaj, where he was talking about, it was around sex and the leadership crisis. So he was talking about an occasion where he was talking to the late Mandela about how there's so much illicit content out there to be consumed freely without any restriction. And he, to an extent, foresaw what's happening today. What would you say about such content that's freely accessible, particularly now with the internet just being...
I think it has an extremely negative influence on our society. It normalizes behaviors that are extreme. So we as living beings, we become kind of trained up in different ways based on what we're exposed to. If I see somebody stealing, it'll become normal for me to see that and then do that eventually. It won't become abnormal behavior. Murder could become the same thing. Sexual activities can become the same thing. So the more we expose ourselves to negative influences, the more it normalizes that behavior. It's just part of our psychology. And then what happens? I start acting out those same behaviors. And then people around me, that I influence will act out the same behaviors. Ultimately, it's such an exploitative tendency. Those behaviors don't bring out the deeper selves we are. They are bringing out very superficial desires we may have, and those desires don't lead to real satisfaction or real joy. So as a result, that exploitative mentality just increases, and it goes from one thing to drugs to violence. It can just spiral like that. So as human beings, we are not progressing very much. And by us thinking that freedom means making these kinds of things available, it's a very unintelligent way of doing things. Like as a parent, you would guide your child into how they do things so that you protect them so they can travel the right path. Similarly, the leaders in society should be thinking how to guide the rest of society so that we don't, as communities and nations, go down paths that lead to our own destruction and take us in a negative path. So leadership is so important that we perceive everything properly in its proper place. Our leaders need to see that and then help direct things so that we can protect innocent people. Yeah.
From a certain perspective as well, I would like to think, or I like to think that this is our 60s. This is our hippie era, kind of, here in Southern Africa. Because you can see like a large number of the youth are rejecting so-called organized religious institutions, and they're looking for something spiritual.
Yes.
What would you say to people who are looking for answers in that time, in that realm?
Yes, I think it's very important that people look for answers in spiritual life. Don't worry so much about the way the organization is structured. Concern yourself with their practices and their teachings. That's what must appeal to you. So when you look at any spiritual path, organized or not, the challenge people have with organized religion is that it is hypocritical, it is exploitative. So look at the teachings and the practices that you need to do, and then do it. If you find that it's not being, generally where you find these exploitative tendencies in organized religion, it is not that the teachings are like that. It's the way the teachings are implemented by the followers that's the problem. Mm-hmm. It is not actually the leaders' teachings that talk about that exploitative and the mentalities that are being practiced. So what we have to do is take the essence of what the teachings are and see how to practice it best. And
the religion itself might be weaponized, because we've seen that. Look at the Crusade Wars leading up to what is now colonization in the world as it is today.
Yes, that's true. Then that's what we have to look at, what the teachings say. Understand what the principles that are involved. Spirituality is based on principles. It is not based only on sentiment. Yes, there is a sentiment of devotion and love, but that develops after a foundation of principles. So those principles have to tie in with us. We have to believe in those principles. So look at whatever is out there, all the spiritual paths out there, and then examine the different principles. Question. It's very important we question, get a clear understanding and become convinced, and then we take to that path wholeheartedly. There has to be that question and answer, that inquiry as to what is it, what am I looking for, what is being offered here. Once we understand those things, then we can say yes, commit. And whether it's organized, it's big or small, it's less important. It's more important for those principles, understanding those principles, seeing if the practices match those principles and support the principles. Every spiritual path has some teachings, and it has some practices that help you develop what's taught, those principles and qualities that are taught. So that's what you're looking for, those principles tying into what you expect, and how does it work, and does it actually take you back to the Supreme Lord, to God, as you'd expect to, in the goal of what you're looking for.
The other argument is that culture is the basis, or culture is what we should all stick to. And then extending itself to culture will be language. And then in terms of linguistics or social linguistics, I'm not sure where I read this, I was studying this some time back. But Apparently, the topmost language is that which can express or describe a thing in more than 5,000 ways. And Sanskrit is in that category and seen as the mother of all languages. So looking at the core, the core point in Sanskrit as that everything extends back to the absolute truth.
Yes.
And without that, then the language is useless.
Yes.
And therefore the language is seen as the language of the gods.
Yes.
What would you say in terms of cultural heritage and people who want to hold on to their cultures and things like that from that perspective?
Yes, culture is extremely important. It provides the binding agent which allows you to practice those principles. It supports the principles that we talked about. But culture without the principles is meaningless. So culture is very critical. If you have that spiritual principles in place and the practices that you have to do, that culture cements that. It provides a supportive environment that enables those spiritual principles or the principles to come to life for you. And that's the purpose of culture. When you remove the principles, then that culture is meaningless. It's like having cement but not holding bricks together. So it's got no purpose. So it's true, culture is critically important, but it must support a spiritual or foundational principles, and then culture has its real place. So generally, if you find a spiritual path which has a cultural support base, that is wonderful. That's really wonderful. But people sticking to culture without any spiritual principles, it becomes a meaningless thing. It's a misplacing priority. Another consumable.
That's the argument that's going on with this new neo-African identity known as Afropolitanism. The old school, or what do you call them, Pan-Africanists. They're like, that's the very problem with Afropolitanism. It doesn't hold on to anything. Principles. It's just a consumable.
It's just a consumable. And it won't give real value in the end. It may be a novel concept for now, but it won't give any real value of substance to anybody practicing it. Even those same practitioners, they will be speaking something else in 3 years' time or 4 years' time. That's why it's there now, because they weren't talking about this 5 years ago, right? And 5 years ago, they will be talking about something else. So it's not going to last for long. It's a phase, and we go through that, which is part of the self-discovery. But it's important that the principles tie in somewhere there so that it can have some substance.
As a father and a husband who's also a spiritualist, what would you say to people who are in that so-called ashram or in that life, in that standard of life world?
Yes, it is a little challenging for someone who's a spiritual practitioner, and when you have wife, children, because generally the tendency is that you go with the flow, you go with the current of what everyone else is doing. And if you look at all the people in your circle, they are doing certain things, and sometimes they go against your spiritual practices and principles. So sometimes it is a little challenging. So it creates additional challenge for you to have the strength and understand how to explain things to your family, to explain it to yourself, understand how things should be done in a practical way, in your family. But more than that, the advantages it gives you in terms of understanding the way to lead your life, and it gives the family such a wonderful foundation to exist even as a family, because that culture is there, the principles are there. You don't have to make it up as you go along. It's all there. You follow it and you got something profound to offer. And when your children ask you questions, you have an answer. And they have faith in you because you have these answers. Your relationship binds better. They can see you for the depth you have, and you're not just floundering around. How can you expect a child to respect a father or a mother who's behaving, getting drunk, neglecting children? What role model are you setting for them? But as a spiritual practitioner, you become naturally a good role model because of your own practices in your spiritual practice. That solidifies the family. It gives you a solid basis on which to face the world and to go further. Your children make their own decisions ultimately of how they live, but you just give them the foundation, and then they do what they need to as they grow up. It's their choice, like how you made your own choice. But at least you've offered them something substantial to take forward.
Give them the choice.
Give them the choice.
The platform to choose.
To choose, yes.
Yeah. I was watching some documentary this morning around algorithms and how AI is the new what's that? The new unicorn, as it were. Everybody's racing in that direction.
Yes.
They're making quite some notable strides in healthcare and all of that, and then it goes to surveillance, constant surveillance. And in your line of profession, how would you integrate spiritual life to this kind of technical advancement?
Yes, technical advancements generally, technology and all the advancements we have in this world, generally they serve the purpose of making our lives more comfortable, making things more convenient, making things easier to do, which we all love. Just go into Google, find out anything, Uber, just get things. It makes life very easy. The only challenge is if we think that the effort we put into these things takes over our lives, we forget the real purpose of our lives. Whether it's AI, it doesn't matter what the topic. These things are there as tools for us to use to make things easier for us. And generally as a spiritualist, we want to make things easier so we have more time to practice our put more energy into our spiritual practices, because that's the real substance of our life. And these things are there. Yes, someone does the hard work, we use it. We have no problem using it. It's easier for us. So there's nothing wrong with it, as long as we don't get so absorbed in it that it becomes the focus of our lives, and it shouldn't be the focus of our lives. Like instant messaging and all, they take your consciousness away from important things because you always look at your phone, etc. These can be distractions. It has its purpose, but we have to learn how to use it so that we get the best out of it, rather than it controlling us. So that's the one danger we have to watch out with anything we engage with, whether it's technology or anything. And same thing for AI or anything else. It'll be the same principle.
No, that's quite true. And then in closing, I'll say you're one of the senior devotees here in Southern Africa. What are your hopes for a cultural, if not spiritual, cultural development in the Southern Hemisphere in the next 10 years?
I'm hoping that this discovering of identity that's happening, especially in Southern Africa specifically, because I'm not so exposed to South America and Australia, etc., and they're very different environments to ours, but at least in Southern Africa, I'm hoping this awakening and this energy that's going into discovering who they are and their identity, their place in the world, takes them to a spiritual place. I'm hoping that happens, because that's what happened in the 60s in the US, for example. It took them, ultimately, they discovered that, hey, you know what, we have to go here. So I'm hoping that is a wonderful opportunity for us to give people exposure to the spiritual dimension of life. And hopefully now that people are looking and more aware, not just accepting the status quo. Accepting the status quo is a real challenge. Questioning everything, which is great. Question everything. But open yourself to any answer, and then you see that at least if the spiritual dimension is opened up, I'm hoping for a real surge in spirituality in this environment.
All right. Thank you very much for coming into
Thank you.
The 108 Live studio, and hopefully we'll have another interview in the near future.
Thank you very much.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.